Welcome back, everyone. We are going to talk about the sarcomere now. The sarcomere is the part of the muscle that is the functional unit of muscle. It's the functional unit of muscle is called a sarcomere. And the sarcomere is made up of contractile proteins and regulatory proteins and structural proteins. The contractile proteins, the two biggies, are going to be actin and myosin. Actin is thin. Actin is thin. Myosin is thick. So I'll label this here. Number one, this is myosin. And over here, number two, this is actin. You can see actin here. Now, troponin and tropomyosin, these are referred to as regulatory proteins. These are the on and off switch, the on and off switch. And you could see with actin, you could see like this ropey, stringy structure like this. And then there's another one here that goes like that and then comes across. So the red strings, that's tropomyosin. And then troponin are these bluish, like those three little circles. So I call troponin the staple that holds tropomyosin in place. So troponin is the cement or the glue or the staple that holds the strings, the tropomyosin, in place. Well, why do we need the staple to hold tropomyosin in place? Well, we have to say, what is tropomyosin covering? So you could see here, I'm going to circle this, it says myosin binding site is covered by tropomyosin. The binding sites are these little targets, these little circles that we see here, those black round circles. Those are binding sites. And you could see that tropomyosin is actually covering them. That protein is covering the binding site, and troponin is actually helping. It's holding those strings in place. It's blocking it. You'll see that the myosin heads on the left have a specific region right at the tip of the heads, right here and here, and it's called the actin binding site. Well, what do you think needs to happen? This actin binding site needs to connect to this on actin. Myosin heads must make contact with the binding site on actin. But tropomyosin is blocking it. And troponin is holding tropomyosin in place to make sure that those binding sites are not exposed. Just want you to get that so far. The structural proteins, titin, nebulin, alpha-actin, myomesin, and dystrophin, these are structural proteins that are really involved with the stabilization of muscle and the alignment of muscle and the elasticity and extensibility of it. Okay, so to review the myofibrils, they're composed of microfilaments. Some are thin and some are thick. The thin ones are called actin. The thick ones are called myosin. But they're arranged in these contractile units called the sarcomere. So the sarcomere is composed of regulatory proteins, tropomyosin and troponin. That's the on and off switch. Contractile proteins, actin and myosin, and then structural proteins. Dystrophin, this one you may have heard of before because you may have heard of muscular dystrophy when there's an autoimmune condition and the body starts to attack its own structural proteins, the dystrophin, muscular dystrophy. So actin is made up of an F strand and G molecules. So I'm going to show you the binding site. We'll show you tropomyosin and troponin again. So remember, tropomyosin is that molecule that extends, that's the rope or the string that covers the myosin binding sites. And troponin, remember, is the glue or the staple that holds tropomyosin in place. Now, what is it that can go after and remove troponin, that can remove the staple? What is the staple remover? The staple remover is calcium. The calcium that's stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So when that calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and hits the sarcomere, it goes after troponin. Troponin gets plucked out, and then tropomyosin, nothing is holding it in place. It shifts or moves, and now there's nothing covering the binding site. And that's when myosin attaches to it. So here in this picture, you have actin here, and these circles, those are the binding sites. But you can see that you can't see the full circles. Why? Because tropomyosin is that protein, that regulatory protein is blocking it, and you can see troponin here is the staple that's holding it in place. Now, if calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and it plucks out the staples, now all of a sudden this tropomyosin can shift and it moves out of the way. When it does, the myosin binding sites are exposed for these myosin heads to make contact. And you can see that there are many, many myosin heads that can make contact with actin. And when they do, a contraction takes place. So again, on the top right, we see that we have all of these G molecules. The G molecules are the circles, and all these G molecules combined makes an F strand. You could see that tropomyosin is the string or the rope that covers the binding sites. Here it's called an active site, but the active site is really the binding site, but it's being covered. But when calcium comes in and removes troponin, then the tropomyosin shifts, and then right here, the myosin head can actually make contact with the binding site to make a contraction. And when it does, you can see on the top, here's the sarcomere at rest. If you look at that H zone, right, that gap is opened, but down here, you could look at the H zone here, it's much smaller in relationship to above. The contraction took place because all of these myosin heads made contact with actin. Myosin is the thicker one, it's the purple with all these little extensions coming off of it, and actin is the thin red one. So what's taking place on the top left here, right, here's the synaptic end bulb. It's releasing what had to happen first, right? Let's say calcium rushed in. So let's say calcium rushed in here. That is what permitted number one to take place. So acetylcholine is released and it binds to the receptor. Where is the receptors? On the motor end plate here. Now, when acetylcholine binds to that motor end plate, to those receptors, and it opens up, sodium rushes in. When sodium rushes in, you get the action potential that goes down the T-tubule. The T-tubule butts up against the sarcoplasmic reticulum right there. What does the sarcoplasmic reticulum contain? Calcium. So the calcium is released. The calcium is released to the sarcomere. Now here's actin. And remember, there's tropomyosin and troponin there. This calcium that is released is going after troponin. It plucks out troponin, or it's the calcium is the staple remover. Tropomyosin shifts out of the way, and now the binding site is exposed, and what is called a cross bridge formation takes place. A cross bridge is nothing other than the myosin kind of bending, almost like an elbow joint, like an elbow and wrist joint. Think of it that way. Here's the elbow, here's the wrist, and it makes contact. The head of the myosin makes contact at the binding site, and then a contraction takes place. All right, well, how does a contraction end? Well, we got to reverse the steps. Well, what was it that started the process? Was acetylcholine. So we have to remove acetylcholine to make the contraction end. How do we remove it? We use an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase. Acetylcholine esterase. Anything that ends in ace is an enzyme. So if acetylcholine esterase is breaking down any excitatory neurotransmitter, such as acetylcholine, then what ends up happening is now the sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to capture or recapture the calcium. And if there's no calcium, then the troponin and tropomyosin complex goes back to its resting state and the contraction ends. And if you need to review those steps, everything here on the left, these 5 steps are the 5 steps on the left. And then these steps that end the contraction are on the right. So at the neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine is released at the synaptic end bulbs. The resulting change in the transmembrane potential of the muscle fiber leads to an action potential, right? So remember, acetylcholine is released. It's in the synaptic end bulb. It binds to the sodium channel. Sodium rushes in, and that's what creates the change to the membrane, creating an action potential. The action potential is going to go down the T-tubule. The T-tubule connects to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That is going, we know it stores the calcium, so it's going to release the calcium around the sarcomere. And then that calcium is going to bind to troponin, the staple. It's going to remove it, creating a change to the troponin tropomyosin complex. Now, if the troponin is removed, then tropomyosin, that string, shifts out of the way. Then the binding sites become exposed and you get a cross bridge that forms. And then the contraction begins, and these repeated cycles can take place. The detachment of the myosin head is powered by ATP. So you need energy in order for the myosin head to detach. You don't need the ATP to create the contraction, you need the ATP to release it. And that's why, if you think about like CSI Miami, CSI New York, crime scene investigation, all these TV shows, when they come across a dead body, the body is in rigor mortis. The body's in a shortened, contracted state. It's in a shortened, contracted state because the person's not alive, they're not producing any more ATP, and if they don't have energy or ATP, the myosin heads can't release, so they're in a shortened, contracted state called rigor mortis. If they're alive, then what ends up happening to release the contracted state, that acetylcholine has to be broken down by acetylcholine esterase. Then the sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to reabsorb that calcium back. And if calcium goes back, then the troponin and tropomyosin complex returns to its normal resting position. There is no cross bridge that forms, and then the muscle goes back to its relaxed state. Now, the events that can produce an action potential at the neuromuscular junction, to review this, you get the voltage-gated calcium channels in the neuron synaptic end bulbs open. So it results in an influx of calcium into the synaptic end bulb. That's what creates the exocytosis of the acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter that gets released into the synaptic cleft. That acetylcholine is going to bind to those sodium channels. Those sodium channels are on the motor end plate of the muscle. Now you get that influx of sodium into the muscle that creates the depolarization or the action potential. And then you get all the following sequence of events that take place. Okay, where the calcium ends up getting released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the calcium goes after the troponin's removed, tropomyosin shifts, the binding sites are available for actin and myosin to connect. And the only thing that can allow the detachment is the acetylcholine esterase. Anything that ends in ase is an enzyme. Acetylcholine esterase breaks down acetylcholine. Okay, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about contraction and relaxation of skeletal muscles.